Since starting my ventures into the world of writing about portable video games, I've heard all this chatter, all this positive talk about a certain little handheld they called the Neo Geo Pocket. Now, it's not something I've ever had any experience with, save from hearing and seeing the name every now and then. I never had one as a younger person. By the time it came out in 1998, I'd already kind of moved on to PC games. But when you spend so much time in the handheld retro gaming world as I have done over the past few years, you can't help but be exposed to other aspects of the niche. Growing up with the Game Boy as I did, I was always aware of other handhelds that were available. A few of my friends had the good old Sega Game Gear and even let me play on it sometimes, not for long admittedly because the batteries would run out, and I remember seeing the Atari Lynx in a dark corner of this game shop I used to go to and being thoroughly confused by what it even was. Nobody had one that I can recall. They were earlier contemporaries of the Game Boy, of course, and by the mid-90s had had their support from Sega and Atari kinda slashed in favor of new generations of home consoles to varying degrees of success. The Neo Geo Pocket, when it launched in late 1998, seemed, to all intents and purposes, kinda late to the party. Nintendo had already brought out the colorized version of their 8-bit machine before this came out, and so, less than 5 months after the monochrome NGP, I'm gonna have to figure out if I like the sound of that acronym. NGPC especially is a bit of a mouthful. In March 1999, the Neo Geo Pocket Color hit the shelves, and was, by all accounts, much more successful. After a bumpy start, SNK finally had a viable competitor to Nintendo. The black and white games still worked, and with only 3 exceptions would get colorized reissues anyway. What's more, they were kind of on their own against the world too. Sega's Nomad wasn't really a proper handheld. Besides, they were having a hard enough time with their Saturn console, although the upcoming Dreamcast would keep Sega afloat for a little bit longer. Atari's commercial failure with the Jaguar had seen them hang up their video game boots long since. So realistically, it was Nintendo and the new boys SNK fighting over the handheld market. Not that it was much of a fight, admittedly. Bandai would soon release the Wonder Swan, which showed a bit of promise due to being spearheaded by none other than Game Boy creator Gunpei Yokoi, but again, something just felt lacking. Call it a stranglehold if you want, you wouldn't be wrong. Nintendo certainly succeeded in cornering the market, despite SNK's console outperforming theirs arguably from a technical standpoint. Looking at the Neo Geo Pocket's library, you can immediately see the problem. There are barely any third-party publishers using the system, with the majority of titles coming out of SNK's, admittedly healthy, catalogs. But that was always going to have its limitations, sadly. Anyway, that's enough about Nintendo. We talk about them enough on the regular show. Now look, I'm sure you're all aware that I'm no tech whiz by any means. I barely even know what a CPU actually does, so I'm not going to talk about the technical details of this console, as there are plenty of more knowledgeable people out there in YouTube land that you should be listening to if that's your bag. What I will say is that I'm quote-unquote aware that the Neo Geo Pocket Color, hell, let's just call it Neo Geo for the sake of this series, shall we? That's too many words. And just saying Pocket or Color is gonna get confusing, seeing as how Nintendo had 2 consoles called exactly those names. I'm aware that the Neo Geo is a stronger console than the Game Boy Color by most metrics you could care to measure it by. But that never stopped Nintendo, whose success was built on their catalog of titles and the exclusivity thereof. But what I can and will talk about is how the games feel to me, however nebulous a concept that might be. It'll be an organic viewpoint from a guy super familiar with one console and a complete virgin to the other. What you're seeing on screen with these Neo Geo reviews will virtually always be my first experiences with that particular game, so I hope to be able to provide a genuine impression for you. Not saying I'm becoming a React channel, that is the lowest echelon of content right there, but I digress. I seem to remember a while back playing a baseball launch title as the first episode in a now hundreds deep video series and being thoroughly disheartened by it, wondering what the hell I'd gotten myself into. Baseball was not a good starting point for sports games on the Game Boy. Fortunately, SNK already had a lot of pedigree with this series, with the first Baseball Stars coming out on the NES way back in 1989, and a couple of sequels a few years later. It was rather excellent for the time, ranking very highly among the many baseball sims the NES boasted. You could not only play a super smooth simulation of the sport, but could also customize and even manage your own teams. It was the first sports game on the console to feature battery backup, meaning it was possible to take your franchise through a whole league season if you wanted. There's also something of a role-playing element to the affair, as each game you win earns you money directly related to the sum of the prestige ratings of the two teams, basically how many paying fans turned up to watch. You can use this money to purchase new players or train up various aspects of the ones you have. This management season stuff has sadly been stripped away from the handheld version, leaving just the very solid gameplay to hold the cartridge up, and it definitely manages this. Immediately, I was not daunted, but excited by the prospect of starting to review a brand new library, and it's just a baseball game, a genre which I've not had the best of times with so far. The frame rate is buttery smooth, with some simple but super effective animations bringing the players to life. Controls are very simple. All you do is place your batter where you want him and press A with the correct timing to hit. You can direct your hits intuitively with the directional buttons, and more often than not it works as you want it to, provided you've got the timing down right. The game does everything it can to help you when you're at the plate. The fielders are quite generous with what they'll fail to catch, your runners don't dawdle about too badly, and the third basemen don't seem to have very powerful arms. When you're pitching though, it'll balance out, so don't think you've got everything easy. Fielding is not automatic. You'll have to move your guys manually and throw to the desired bases by pressing right, up or left along with A when you've got the ball. You can dive to make catches if it looks like you're not going to be near the flight of the ball, but don't think for a second that this is easy to pull off. When it works though, you'll feel like $1 million, so don't give up. Baseball Stars doesn't get bogged down with too many features, neither on the options side of things nor in-game itself. It's just a really solid, addictive, utterly playable rendition of baseball. Almost as if to show Nintendo how a sports game launch title should be done, this is never going to win any realism awards or be acclaimed for its depth. What it does really well and is quite the start for the console, it must be said. If there's one singular genre of games Neo Geo Pocket creators SNK is famous for, it has to be fighting games. With SNK relying so heavily on their own portfolio of properties rather than third-party developers, it was certainly a wise move to build your new handheld console around what you're good at and proven at. You already have the name recognition and so the fanbase, plus it's certainly one way to fill a niche. Handheld consoles up to this point had basically nothing but limited and stripped-back ports of Mortal Kombat and Street Fighter II, plus some equally limited and stripped-back original titles that didn't even have the name value to live off. In fact, most of the minute number of fighting games worth their chops on the Nintendo Game Boy are the ones that SNK and Takara were involved in. Samurai Shodown, Battle Arena Toshinden, and of course the King of Fighters entries. There were actually a few decent ones based on Yu Yu Hakusho, but I'd be surprised if you had them as a kid. These were done by Tomy, a company who, ironically, merged with Takara in 2006. So there you go. Where other handhelds, and even earlier consoles, struggled wasn't anything necessarily to do with the processing hardware or anything like that. You'd have to think that a 2D fighting game isn't the absolute most taxing thing you could put through a CPU or whatever. I don't know, I'm no programmer, it might be. But honestly, it's much more fundamental than that. Only having two face buttons is always going to limit you a bit when compared to the arcade, and that's even the case here. You can expect some smaller movesets, and I'm not going to pretend otherwise. Mostly though, it's the directional buttons. Combos or special moves often rely on sweeping, circular motions or rapid fluctuations in direction, something made fairly intuitive when you have a joystick, but rendered really difficult with just a D-pad. This is the main problem with, as an example, any of the aforementioned Mortal Kombats on Game Boy. Looking up the move lists presents you with these unachievable combinations of button presses that are virtually impossible to pull off in the tiny time window the game allows you. Couple that with whatever dropped frames or swallowed inputs the game itself might struggle with, and this becomes exponentially harder. SNK really lent into their fighting game pedigree with the Neo Geo Pocket, with the inclusion of what's been affectionately called the clicky stick. This is the D-pad replacement the console has, a thumb-sized micro-switched joystick that was the first handheld to feature what had become a pretty common thing with home consoles of the day. This allowed for speedy, sweeping half or quarter circle turns, making what was next to impossible before incredibly simple. This elementary change, more than literally anything else, immediately rendered portable portable fighting games something that could actually be done now. Of course, it'd take more than just that to make a solid game. Thankfully, everything else you could want seems to have been achieved as well. Following the same basic storyline, as much as that really matters in one of these, as the King of Fighters 97, you can play either as a single fighter in single round competition, or pick a trio, where you have to knock out all the opponents consecutively and your own health doesn't replenish completely in between rounds. Impressively, there are 15 fighters to choose from, 4 stables of 3 members each, and then 3 individuals. You'll get the Heroines team, featuring Yuri Sakazaki, Athena Asamiya, and of course, face of the franchise, Mai Shiranui, the South Town team of Ryo, Kim, and Terry Bogard, and so on. But when picking your trio, you don't have to stick to this, just pick who you want. The controls are both simple and intuitive, and useful and in-depth. The lack of buttons has been countered well by having each one perform multiple things. Thankfully, it's all kept distinct, so you're able to still pull off what you're trying to. You can tap a face button to do a light punch or kick, or hold them down to do something more damaging. It's a subtle difference that's needed, but one that you'll quickly get a feel for. A and B together will pull off a heavy attack, and even perform an evade using A and B when falling. Up, followed quickly by forwards or back, pulls off a big jump. You get a power gauge which needs to be charged up. Now you do this normally by holding down A and B, and when it's full you can pull off your character's super move. These will usually involve some kind of rotation of the joystick as mentioned. These super moves can also be activated when you're at low life though, which is quite a cool gimmick. It ensures that even if you're getting pummeled, the fight's never over. If you can get the bar charged at the same time when your life bar's flashing, you're actually able to supercharge this super move, making it even more powerful. Fights have a really great dynamic thanks to this. The advantage can change hands quickly. It's miraculous how simple the moves are to pull off, and calls into sharper relief just how much the Game Boy, and a lot of other consoles to be fair, struggled. Here, the similarity to how the arcade game feels is super impressive, and it does so much to make the more limited moveset possibilities still feel like a fully fleshed out control scheme that just feels wonderful to play. The game really impresses with its visual fidelity as well. Now, this happens to be one of only 3 of the monochrome Neo Geo that was never colorized and re-released, although we would get King of Fighters Round 2 fairly shortly. Even so, the backgrounds are impeccably drawn, and these super deformed characters are immediately recognizable and wonderfully presented with smooth animations. It's a little known or utilized feature that the Neo Geo does actually have connectivity functionality, most likely due to the lack of necessary hardware or player demographics, but you can actually augment these fighting games by connecting them to others, sometimes unlocking new characters this way. Most profoundly, perhaps, this doesn't just feel like a handheld spin-off or a lackluster port, but holds its own legitimate place in the franchise. Fans of the series will undoubtedly have their favorite warriors whom they always gravitate to, and from the aggressive rushdown tactics of Terry Bogard to the more methodical, zoning approach favored by Athena, the attention to detail with regards to the characters' individual playstyles is second to none, honestly. Gameplay really is the heart and soul for any fighting game, and with King of Fighters Round 1, SNK immediately took center stage in the niche. No other fighting game on any other handheld up to this point comes anywhere close to this, not even the King of Fighters titles on Game Boy. It's a good job I don't score stuff in comparison to other consoles, because I might have to revisit what I gave those ones otherwise. It took me around 75% of the Game Boy library before I completed my side quest of finding a good fighting game. Neo Geo got it on launch day. A real testament to this philosophy of attempting quality over quantity comes in the form of the single solitary soccer game found on the Neo Geo. Where most consoles out there will have reams of sports titles of varying levels of value, SNK seemed to pick their moments a bit more. We'd see a few baseball games, understandable given its popularity in Japan as well as North America, but only one tennis game, a couple of golfers, and this one football title. That's pretty much it, and I can't even pretend I'm disappointed by that. Neither a sports fan nor a sports video game fan. I'd much rather check out the plethora of fighters and puzzle games the system promises. Still, when a sports game is done well, they definitely do have something to offer, even if you're not that interested in the activity yourself. The launch title, Baseball Stars, was perhaps minimalist, but when it plays as well as it does, you don't mind the lack of features. Neo Geo Cup 98 and its Color Plus enhanced version certainly doesn't skimp in this department. You can play a single game and a multiplayer versus one, which are fairly self-explanatory, but where the game really shines is in the story mode. Here you select one of 16 national teams from around the world and play and manage them through the Neo Geo tournament. It's a bit like the World Cup. You'll start first in a 4-team qualifying group stage, where each of the 4 teams plays the others in a round-robin format, 3 points for a win, 1 for a tie, with the top 2 placed sides going through to the knockout stages. Then it's single elimination until there's only one nation left standing. There's something of a team development concept at play here, where you can buy various items of kit for your players, which will buff one of their stats at the cost of others. Obviously your own skill comes into it too, but stats really do have an effect here. A player with a high technique will be more likely to skip over a tackle, and one with a higher speed will visibly run faster. So for example, you could buy some better boots for your midfielder, which would increase his speed stat, or better studs, which will help your defenders tackle harder. Within each category, however, are lots of other choices. For instance, the boots called Rockets will give a huge +4 to speed, but reduce your tackling ability by 5. These will be perfect for strikers who don't really need to tackle all that much anyway. There are throwaway ones too that give a stat up but only last for one game, perfect for equipping your whole team with for the final. Some categories will also have a special item that costs way more money but will do stuff like increase player speed when they have the ball or massively improve a player's long-range shots. A particular favourite of mine is the 2100 gold Wig, which grants a +2 buff to all players' stats except for a -6 in heading. Well, you wouldn't want to muss up such an expensive dome piece, would you, Wayne? Don't expect to be able to afford these right away, of course. Your team isn't funded by some Saudi oil tycoon or anything. You'll have to earn the cash by winning games. Before each match, as well as at half-time, you have access to your team's formation, which again is quite in-depth. There are loads to choose from, including a 2-7-1, which seems like a really bad strategy if you ask me. You can swap your team around as needed, and can check any of your players' stats, items held, and conditions. Yet players can pick up knocks or even get properly injured throughout the course of the season, meaning you'll need to use your squad's depth to stay the course. You can buy ailment cures in the shop, so if your player's got a broken femur or something, just bandage them up and get them back out there. Probably don't do that actually. This storyline mode is really immersive and doesn't just last for one season. I think you can play indefinitely if you want. Now I've never seen it myself in game, but apparently agents will come to you every now and then offering to sell you a new player. That's definitely not how international football works, but even so, it's a pretty cool feature if true. The whole thing is seemingly geared up to being basically the perfect football game. Unfortunately, there's just one problem. That's the gameplay, which is actually kind of important. This is by no means the worst soccer experience I've ever had, that's for damn sure, but there are too many little niggles and irritants to take it into the realm of excellent. Honestly, it's lackluster, it's not even that enjoyable, and it's super disappointing. Visually, it suffers terribly from having no mini-maps, so you have absolutely no idea where your teammates are. Well, there are arrows, sure, but they're not helpful in the slightest, as chances are there'll be an opponent in front of your player anyway. Passing is incredibly unreliable. A tap of the A button does a short pass, but the kicker puts so little power on it that the ball won't reach your colleague most of the time. Holding the button down is no better, as this completely removes the targeting, causing your dude to just smash the ball like it's an influencer's like button. How do you even smash a like button, by the way? Surely it's just a mouse click, isn't it? If you're playing with weak players, expect to get tackled all the time. You really need high technique players in your midfield to stand a chance of getting past opponents. My biggest gripe, however, is with your own goalkeeper. They'll not catch shots all that often, and a diving save will virtually always rebound the ball straight into the feet of the striker, even when it makes no physical sense for it to do so, after which they'll nearly always score. What a shame. It all looks and sounds so good as well. Them graphics are to die for. Loads of frames of animation, players of a great size without reducing the view distance too much. The sense of depth perception when the ball is in the air is incredibly effective. The few lines of voice acting are excellently done too. Hey, I must reiterate though that the controls and such certainly aren't broken. You can play this game, just don't expect to have a ton of fun with it. I'm actually kind of gutted about the gameplay flaws in Neo Geo Cup. This really did have the framework to be a wonderful soccer game, but unfortunately, the ball sailed over the bar into the terraces. Rosette, as they say. Unbelievable, Jeff. Originally released solely in Japan as Puzzle Tsunagete Pon, this is a wonderfully unique take on the falling block puzzler that sits somewhere between Magical Drop and Quarth. Differently coloured blocks descend in rows from the top of the screen, and your aim is to shoot chains between separated groups of the same colour, which will then get removed, and everything else ascending upwards towards the top of the screen. If the blocks touch the line at the bottom, it's game over. You control this little cannon thing at the bottom and can only move horizontally. You first aim at a block in the colour you want to link, and then can fire infinite chain pieces of that colour upwards using the A button, where it'll rest as high up as it can. Link as many chains together as you like, they'll conglomerate into this kind of grid and will automatically complete if the grid touches something else in that colour. It's an incredibly simple formula taken here, but the key is in the foresight of what will happen once the groups get removed. You can easily chain many matches together, as there's never more than 3 or 4 different colours on this 9-tile wide board. The simplicity works to the game's benefit, as you really need to be able to work quickly. The pace of the whole thing is excellently frantic at times, and being able to puzzle out what's going to happen at a glance is very satisfying, making the game properly addictive once you get into it. If it was too convoluted or too difficult to visualize, the whole thing wouldn't be nearly as much fun. Now, that's not to say there's not a learning curve to it, and you can certainly improve as you go along. For example, at first it's all too easy to become single-minded in trying to eliminate 2 massive clumps of color at, say, opposite ends, not realizing that you might inadvertently short-circuit yourself by connecting the chain to a single block in the middle or something like that. The way around this is to build up chains from both sides simultaneously, then link all 3 in the middle with the final connecting piece. Very rewarding when you pull something like that off. There are 3 game modes here, all of which have their own decent longevity and don't feel tacked on at all. The first is Normal mode, which is stage-based yet also survival. Essentially, the levels will progress indefinitely until 2 special blocks with the letter C on them appear. Now all you need to do is connect those 2 C's together and the level will auto-clear and you'll move on to the next one. You never know when they'll appear. I couldn't determine if you needed to clear a certain amount out first or get X number of points, but once they do, it's a frantic race to clear the way so you can link them. As well as all this, there's a really cool little card collecting gimmick to go along with normal mode. If you see this sand timer in the lower left corner ticking down, should you manage to beat the level before this depletes, you'll earn a card with a monster on it, showing its height, weight, and a little quote by them. There are 91 of these all told, and while the cards themselves don't do anything as such, it still serves as an incentive to keep replaying levels. The other game modes include Battle, which requires you to link with a friend, and Clear All, which gives you a bunch of puzzles and a par score. Say if a puzzle says 3, then it means you can beat it in 3 moves. You're able to take more than this if you want. You won't fail unless you're left with a single block, that obviously cannot be removed at that point. Little else to say about Puzzle Link, really, except that if you're even slightly into the falling block puzzler thing, or even puzzlers in general, this is right up there. There's a harder difficulty setting if you're more experienced, completing your card collection is very addictive, controls are tight and responsive, and the presentation is really bold and vibrant. Puzzle Link actually has a sequel too, if that's not enough for you. I look forward to it. This is the sort of game that every handheld library should have as a requirement. The third of 3 sports titles to come out on the monochrome Neo Geo Pocket is Yumekobo's swing at making a tennis game. We saw this development team in the previous episode with their fantastic Puzzle Link. Now, there may have only been 2 other sports games so far, there weren't actually that many more to come in fairness, but in terms of success stories, we're on a 50% rating, I'd say. Baseball Stars was a bit limited in the things you could actually do, but was equally one of the smoothest, most playable baseball sims I've ever played on a handheld console. However, the system's solitary soccer title, Neo Geo Cup 98, had the opposite result in a way, being sadly quite disappointing in the gameplay department, despite having a vast and varied assortment of options and a real depth in the team building side of things. Game modes, tactical fluffery and all that kind of stuff is nice to have, but honestly with a console you're probably playing in short 20 to 30 minute spurts, they're not nearly as important as engaging gameplay, a working physics engine, and good, solid, reliable controls. So given the choice, I'd always stump for how Baseball Stars did it over the footy one. Thankfully that's what we have here in Pocket Tennis. You get the choice between tournament play or an exhibition match, and a bunch of different characters with their own strengths and weaknesses. There are 8 to choose from at the start of of the game, with a couple of unlockable players should you do well in the tournaments. Some players, like Alice or Mao, have really good court speed, meaning you'll need to compensate for her reduced shot power by dashing all over the place and trying to return the ball to an area where your opponent won't get to it. Others, such as David, have a lot more power but can't move quite as nimbly, so your best bet there is to try and hit past the other player with force. The controls in-game are as simple as you like. The A button hits a regular stroke, with B doing a softer one, with this also counting on serves. You can go for an ace, I've never managed this, by hitting it hard with A, or be more delicate. The course of the ball is determined not only by the direction you choose, but also by how long you hold it for. Don't go all out here, because depending on your position, you can easily fault if you put too much angle on it. Still, pretty intuitive controls all round, which is great. You get lobs and volleys to add into your arsenal of shots as well, which are drawn really well perspective-wise. There are quite a lot of tournaments that unlock once you win the previous one. At first, you'll be going through single-set competition over 3 rounds, but after time, the match length will increase up to 5 sets. These tournaments can go on for a while. Luckily, the opponents don't really get more difficult or anything like that. Think of it like a tour, how they do in actual tennis or something, whereby you might be playing in all sorts of different places or formats, but the players are typically the same. For the most part, anyway. If you get to something called the Ares Cup, you'll play a special character at the end called Karo. Beat him and you can actually unlock him. There's also someone called Amebia, who you'll unlock after beating the first tournament. Like I say, there are loads of different cups to win. Some are even thematic based on the time of year, or the time of year you've set your Neo Geo to anyway. So for instance, you might play the Capricorn Cup in January and so on. We're already getting a feel for the graphical accomplishments that were frequently achieved on Neo Geo. Again, I don't really want to compare to Game Boy all that much, but it's pertinent here, I think. The screen here is only 8 rows larger than the Game Boy or Color, so you can't even put it down to a better resolution necessarily, but so often the sprites and backgrounds just had that much more attention to detail put into it, especially compared to where we are in the Game Boy Color's library by now. But it's not just about the fidelity of the individual frames, but the slickness of the animation that always catches me off guard a little bit. I'm not a techie guy, so I don't know why this would be, but you rarely, if ever, saw the equivalent smoothness on Game Boy, and it never hinders frame rate or anything either. For the sake of balance, I've yet to find a sound design that I'm super impressed by. The voice synthesis on Neo Geo Cup was really clear, but I prefer the harsher Nintendo waveforms from a Game Boy chiptune as opposed to the more rounded off Neo Geo ones, which sound similar to a Game Gear or a Master System. Not to say it's bad at all, just a personal preference, and I'm sure there are some fantastic soundtracks on Neo Geo. Why wouldn't there be? Sports games are obviously more fun if you're already a fan of the subject matter. I've learnt that to my detriment plenty of times in the past. I wouldn't consider myself a fan of basically any of them. I like pro wrestling, if that counts. It doesn't. It doesn't mean you can't enjoy the video games. I've had a whale of a time with American football titles, baseball, ice hockey, basketball not so much. Someone please find me a decent basketball game on a handheld. Well, not really caring about any of the actual events. The main thing is, are the controls responsive? Do they do what they say they do? Is there a stupidly long difficulty hump to get over, or can you just pick up and go for it? I got this one immediately. It's the sort of thing that if you can't get a feel for it, there's not really anything that anyone can do to help you. It's so intuitive and immediately just feels great. There's possibly not enough variation for me to play through every single tournament, if that's a thing you can even achieve in this game, but if you want to crack off some tennis, then look no further. We come to the first real challenge for me in reviewing Neo Geo games, the first kind of obscure Japanese language only title that really does require quite a lot of reading. In theory, you'd think the user interface here should be quite self-explanatory, being mostly pictorial icons, but even so, it's been a tricky one to analyze. It's not the first time I've done something like this though, so I'll try my best. Melon-chan's Growth Diary is one of those life simulation affairs that the original Game Boy saw several of towards the end of its lifespan, mostly in Japan only, it must be said. I guess it gained popularity with the original Tamagotchi games that were based on the eternally confiscated little keyring thing that populated school teachers' desks in the mid-90s. Here, you're guiding this anthropomorphized melon girl called Melon-chan, yeah, I know, through different phases of her life. You'll need to make choices about her education, hobbies, and daily routines that all affect how she evolves as a character. What you opt for in each situation will impact the growth of her skills, appearance, and even personality. Like many games in this genre, there's no real story other than the development of the main character. There's no great narrative or villain to overcome. It's more up to the player to infuse the gameplay with as much or as little narrative as you want to, and simply enjoy Melon-chan's responses and reactions to in-game events. The areas that your charge can grow are in categories such as intelligence, physical strength, artistic ability, and social skills. They all play a role in determining her final form and personality when she reaches adulthood. For example, focusing more on intellectual activities will result in a more academically inclined Melon-chan, whereas playing more sport or physical activities with her will make her more athletic in the long run. In addition to stat building, there are various random events that occur throughout the game which can influence her growth. These typically require you to make quick decisions, adding a level of unpredictability and engagement to the gameplay. You might have a random visit from a neighbor or discover a new hobby, that sort of thing, and how you choose to react to these situations changes Melon-chan in some way, with no two playthroughs ever being quite the same. There are a number of mini-games that flesh out the experience a bit, which are usually fairly simple tasks like cleaning the bedroom, cooking some lunch, or dance practice. They break up the rather passive stat management of the main gameplay and can improve Melon-chan's mood as well. The protagonist is quite the adorable little character, it's fair to say, and the anime-inspired graphics look very nice throughout, even if they don't change all that much. Audibly, it's efficient, if not groundbreaking. The music and so on certainly isn't intrusive, which is fine. Fine is a common theme in Melon-chan no Seichouki, it seems. It's all just fine. Honestly, it's very hard to really say too much more about this, as it doesn't have a great deal of complexity to it. That's kinda typical of the genre itself, though. I guess it's a nice change of pace from the very action-oriented Neo Geo Pocket library, and it certainly stands out because of that. As obscure as it is, there's not a ton of information out there, but it feels very similar to any number of other games released around this time on other systems. It's the only one on Neo Geo as far as I can see, though, so there's that. There was going to be a sequel as it happens, but that fell through a few months after it was announced in 1999. The console was still going at this point, so we can only assume this first one didn't sell all that well. A shame, perhaps, but then also perhaps one was enough. There's not a ton of ground left to cover with something like this. Shogi has provided me with a real challenge while making video game reviews on this channel, especially because I deal with consoles that have a lot of Japanese exclusive games on them. If you have a Japanese console, you're gonna get certain things as a given. There's gonna be mahjong, there's gonna be edutainment stuff about kanji, and there's gonna be shogi on it. Mahjong I can just about fathom, as it's something that's bridged the gap to Western audiences a little bit. I don't need games consoles to learn Japanese, especially not these days with all the apps I have on my phone. Shogi, however, I've always struggled with. I don't know why. Perhaps it's because I'm not even very good at chess, and this is like a galaxy brain version of it. The aim of shogi, if you're not aware, is the same as regular chess, capture the king. However, there's certainly more of a robust learning curve and barrier to entry that can be quite daunting, especially if you can't read the tiles. Each piece's moveset is different, which is something you'd have to learn in chess anyway, but there's this drop rule mechanic that makes things a little bit more complex. Here, captured pieces can be redeployed on the board as your own, which adds a fresh layer of strategy. Also, pieces can be promoted, which gives them augmented or sometimes completely altered movesets. No, I think the main issue I've always had is a really stupidly simple one, and it's 100% on me, I get that. The pieces are all the same shape, differing only in the character they have emblazoned on them. It's not like chess, where your pawn, bishop, knight and whatever all look different and so are immediately recognizable. Here, you need to know what the kanji represents. Maybe I should pick up more of those edutainment cartridges. Is there one specifically for shogi? Probably somewhere. It's fine at the very start of the game when the board is in its default position, but once stuff starts getting moved around, I completely lose track of what's going on. That's no fault of the game's, of course, it's my own incompetence. For those actually familiar with the game's intricacies, it's rare to be let down by a video game version of it. Master of Syougi has clean and simple presentation, never attempting to dazzle players with flashy graphics or effects, with sparse but unintrusive sound design, focusing on functionality and ease of use. The pieces are traditionally styled, which could have been augmented perhaps with a more modernized version. I don't know if there's even any precedent for something like that, and the interface is pretty intuitive. The AI is well programmed by by all accounts, providing a competent challenge with accessible difficulty levels. It might have been nice for some sort of introduction for beginners, as everything feels impenetrable at first, but for those already versed in shogi, the CPU's complexity provides plenty of replay value. Clearly, things like Master of Syougi have their niche. It's one of those titles that was included in the library to attempt to capitalize on a different market to players who'd gravitate towards the beat-em-ups, RPGs, and sports games more popular on the system, and you can't really fault SNK for doing so. I'm personally never going to play this again, I can virtually guarantee you that much, but that's not a knock on it. It's not something I need in my life, but it might be in yours. Not even out of the first couple of months of the system's life, the second game in SNK's Pocket Fighting series, after King of Fighters Round 1, gave us a portable version of their weapons-based fighting game. Actually based on the Neo Geo version of Samurai Shodown 4, this is not technically the same game as that of the same name that came out on Game Boy in 1994, or indeed 1996's Japanese exclusive Netu Samurai Spirits Zankuro Musuken, which is better known in the West as Samurai Shodown 3. There'll be some recognizable roster members for anyone familiar with earlier entries in the series. It shares a lot of similarity with number 3, with only a few tweaks actually. In fact, storyline-wise, this is the second part of a story that takes place between the events of games 1 and 2, the first being number 3, so in effect, this one directly follows on from the third. The separating feature with Shodown games is the use of weapons rather than merely hand-to-hand combat. It was one of the earliest in the genre to really do this, and helped especially to set it apart from other subsections of the King of Fighters family. How all these SNK games intersect is a difficult topic to broach, but it doesn't really matter. All you really need to know is those 3 letters virtually always represent quality when it comes to fighting games. As expected, the game translates excellently to the handheld format. The more of these I play, the more it becomes evident that this was exactly the sort of thing they had in mind when they designed the Neo Geo Pocket. It's actually kind of difficult to go back to using a D-pad for fighting games once you've been spoiled with the 8-way clicky stick. It's so comfortable to do half and quarter circle inputs to fire up your special moves. As a quick aside, don't worry that you can't experience the controls here because you don't have the original hardware. For emulation purposes, I swear by 8-bit Do's controllers. Their SNES-based one is pretty much the best retro-style controller I've ever used, and I've got through a few, as you can imagine. I recently treated myself to their Neo Geo CD one as well. They spent 3 years making this thing, and it's outstanding just how close to the original it feels. It even sounds like it. D-pads are one thing, but it's a lot harder to replicate the clicky stick. SNK must have been impressed because they happily stuck their name on it. But this isn't a product placement video. Unless you want to give me a call, 8-bit dude, we can talk. The controls are easy to pick up, difficult to master, exactly what you want from a fighting game. Movement is straightforward, down to duck, up to jump, back to guard, that sort of thing. The A button is a simple punch if you don't have a weapon, whereas if you do, a tap will perform a quick light slash, and a longer press is fiercer. B kicks, which you may not feel like using as much when you've got a massive samurai sword, but it does come in handy. Down and B will do a low kick, diagonally forwards and down with B sweeps the leg. You can tap forwards twice to run, then do a dashing attack by pressing A or B. A and B together performs a dodge, which isn't always successful but makes you temporarily invincible if you manage to time it right. You can even taunt while dodging. Pressing down twice during a dodge taunts, which raises your rage meter a bit. Pressing up twice instead performs a suicide move. It's called Honorable Death here. You lose the round, but immediately start the next one with a full rage bar and a special attack loaded up. That's not it for the controls, of course. There are several other little tricks you can pull off depending on the fighter's relative positions, whether you're downed, and so on. You can combo moves, disarm opponents, and all sorts of tricky things. As well as that, each character obviously has their signature attacks. These actually vary depending on whether you choose your character's slash or bust mode. This choice alters the moveset, but can also replace weapons. Nakamura, for example, has a blade in slash mode, but runs with a wolf familiar in bust mode. Some fighters are quite similar between the two styles, but for others it's almost like playing a completely different character. Very cool extra layer of detail there. Let's talk about this rage gauge I mentioned. It's essentially how pissed off your characters become, filling up only when you take damage. If you can max it out, not only will your attacks inflict more damage than usual, but you're also able to pull off the character's super move. They're usually performed, it might be always actually, but I haven't played every character yet, by pressing back, forwards, then down A and B altogether. Hit that and it should be pretty much game over. It can also be called the disarmament move, seeing as how it disarms your opponent as well. There are both difficulty levels and player levels, and they work a bit differently from each other. The difficulty level is what you think it is, and it's set from the main menu. However, during the character select section, you're able to choose your own class as well, beginner, medium, or expert. This alters the controls a bit. In beginner mode, you have a simplified method to pulling off a 4-hit slash combo, as well as the disarmament moves. Medium is just your standard controls and is what I gravitate towards basically all the time. On expert mode, your guard is removed altogether, meaning you need to rely on dodging much more often. As a trade-off, you inflict more damage, so it might be worth learning this way from the off if you're feeling confident. Other than that, everything else works as standard for fighting games. You get an interesting story mode with dialogue that changes depending on who you fight as, progressing through the field in best of 3 bouts, or whatever you select. There's a survival mode as well, where you regain a bit of health between each fight and last as long as you can. The game looks pretty great whether you play it in the monochrome or the colorized. It's not full color as such, as there was no Pocket Color release of this, but the palette swaps fit the build just fine. As we've seen multiple times already with this library, it's the frames of animation that are most striking. Such love has gone into making these characters as vibrant and full of life as possible, and it really shows. Plus, the game is a bit of a banger, not gonna lie. It might feel a bit lopsided to have this many fighting games in what is quite a small library by all accounts, but when they're as fantastic as this, who cares, man? The final game released on the original monochrome Neo Geo Pocket starts off a mini-series of quick-fire games by Dino Corporation. They put together individual cartridges based on blackjack, poker, baccarat, hanafuda, horse racing, and 2 slot machine games, of which this is the first one. Thing is, not a one of them really justifies having its own cartridge all to itself, as none of them are particularly in-depth. I suppose there was shelf space to fill up, but all the same, you could have wanged all of these games onto 1 or 2 cartridges, and it would have been much better value. I'll still look at all of them, of course, but don't expect me to dwell on them for too long. Neo Cherry Master is possibly the simplest, shallowest game on the whole console. It's literally just a slot machine. Bet up to 16 imaginary coins on the outcome of a spin, which will be allocated first across the 3 horizontal lines, then the 2 diagonals, then the 3 verticals, up to 2 per line. The prize money obviously depends on what comes up, and while you can stop the reels quicker, you don't get control over all of them individually, so there's no skill here at all, it's just luck. If you want the ultimate slimline experience, play Simple Mode, which is just the reels themselves. However, Original Mode allows you to take any winnings you get and play a higher-lower card guessing game. You'll get given a playing card and will have to guess whether the next one is higher or lower. Now, this would be fine, I suppose, if it weren't for my bullshitometer going off like it so frequently does in these illusory games of chance. In 1998, when this came out, this little ruse wouldn't have been discoverable necessarily, but now we have emulators and save states, so I'm onto your scheme. You press A to choose higher, it's called big here, and B to choose lower. Note, by the way, that if you're used to playing Game Boy, or indeed any Nintendo console, that the A and B buttons are reversed here, so you may have to perform some mental gymnastics. At least I do. I was finding myself getting caught out far too frequently with unlikely outcomes. I'd go higher than a 4, for instance, and be getting 2s and 3s way more often than was mathematically realistic. And there's a reason for that. The game doesn't predetermine what the next card is. That would be fair. You can save state before choosing higher or lower, and the result will be different depending on what you pick. So often you'll come across a bet which is impossible to win, regardless of which you pick. Say the number is a 5. You'd likely pick higher, right? You might win if the game decides you're allowed, but you might also get a 3 or something. Well, that's alright, you save stated before choosing, so you reload and go lower instead. You know the next cards are 3, right? Nope, this time it's a king. And before you say, well, it's just random then, nah, good buddy. Each time you press higher, you'll get a 3. Each time you press lower, you'll get a king. It's fixed so that you can't win. With a game that's already kind of pointless to begin with, this tips it over the edge into actually kinda crappy behavior. The whole thing's a troll, and I'll be curious to see if the card-based ones Dana Corporation came out with do a similar thing. It strikes me as a little odd that this title got a colorized re-release when a couple of excellent fighting games like Samurai Shodown and King of Fighters Round 1 didn't. They would get sequels, I guess, but hey, we absolutely did not need to get cheated in full color as well as monochrome. Skip the hell out of this one, guys. You can tell SNK were proud of their fighting games, and rightly so, as this is the third they released already on the Neo Geo Pocket, and we're only just into double figures in the library. The first game, King of Fighters Round 1, shared the same storyline, such as storylines are in fighting games. It's often just the cast members and whoever the final boss is, as the King of Fighters 97 for arcade, Neo Geo CD and so on, and marked the end of the Orochi saga that had actually taken place over the course of 3 games since 1995. Round 2 is not quite a direct sequel to that game, in that the arc was over. It's based on the storyline of King of Fighters 98 and has a different final antagonist. Now you'll be fighting against a guy called Rugal Bernstein, a German baron who we first saw in King of Fighters 94 and who died in 95. He's now a reanimated monster called Omega Rugal and is similarly creating clones of many of the mainline characters and making them do his bidding. Compared to Round 1, the roster features several returning mainstays, as well as a handful of faces that weren't in the first Neo Geo Pocket game. Also, some of the teams have switched up. If you're not aware, typically you can take the story modes in these games with your favourite solo character, or in a team of 3. The characters you can choose align themselves loosely within these trios that might be called the Super Babe team, or the New Faces, or whatever. The New Faces must have turned heel or something at the end of Round 1, because they're now named after the deceased villain of that game, calling themselves Orochi Team. Athena and Yuri Sakazaki have kicked Mai Shiranui out of the heroines, recruited Art of Fighting's Kasumi Todo, and renamed themselves the Super Babes. Mai herself has replaced Kim Kafwan as the third member of Terry Bogard's Southtown team, with Kim not featuring at all this time round. All that's not really relevant unless you care a lot about the lore, because if you choose to play the game 3 on 3, you can just pick whichever 3 combatants you want anyway. You're not restricted to a set trio. How this team mode works is rather simple. You'll pick your 3, then the order in which you want them to fight. The first fighter from each team will face off, with the winner staying on. Note that you don't regain very much health between rounds. That would be totally unfair. It seems to be something like 10%. If you can wipe out the enemy trilogy before they do the same to you, you'll move on. After 2 lots of fights, you'll come across a solo fight. This is a bit of a tougher scrap, but made easier because it's 3 on 1 this time. Same goes right at the end when you're fighting Rugal. You get 3 fighters but only have to beat him once, and his health doesn't regenerate that much. Luckily, there are 3 difficulty levels to choose from. Be aware though that the game actually defaults to hard, so you might want to go into the options and change that if it's your first time. The heart of any King of Fighters game is its gameplay, and you'll find, especially if you're playing this on original hardware or something with an analog stick, that this game really shines in this regard. Like its siblings on the system, these games are perfectly sculpted to feel so natural within the confines of the system. Luckily though, if you only have a D-pad at your disposal, or worse, a keyboard, you're more than able to still play the game. You might not enjoy trying to pull off the special attacks quite as much, but then that's true of virtually all fighting games. It makes me wonder how games like Street Fighter 2 or Mortal Kombat were so popular on SNES or Genesis. There's pretty much no way I could readapt to an up, down, left, right controller after being spoiled with this one. One of the cool new features in Round 2 is this making mode, and it's actually the better game mode probably. Here, you're able to create a custom character to a certain extent. Nothing graphically. You'll choose a base fighter that you want to model yourself on, rename them, and then through the story campaign you can sculpt your movesets, abilities, and even add special features to your character like unique win phrases and such. It's not massively deep, but definitely invites a replayability factor that you love to see. With a story mode that can be completed in a relatively short amount of time, it's certainly welcome. The real appeal of King of Fighters and any sort of game like this isn't just about beating the final boss, though. That's almost irrelevant. It comes from learning and mastering specific characters, as they all have their own feel and intricacies to get the hang of. It's important to recognize that, yes, Round 2 might not be as deep or complex as its arcade or console counterparts, but the roster size is admirable and movesets are full enough to bring plenty of variation depending on who you pick. What you're looking at here is, put most simply, one of the best games on this system, and one of the best handheld fighting games of its era. It's a real testament to SNK's ability to adapt their franchises to basically any of their platforms. Between the AES, the MVS, or this beautiful little portable thing, there's a real feeling of continuity. If you know one, you'll feel at home with the others. Crucially, it feels like all of them had the same level of attention given to them. Nintendo in the late 90s certainly didn't care about the Game Boy Color as much as they did their N64. Another short review here as we delve back into Dyna Corporation's gambling collection. Neo Dragon's Wild is 5-card video poker played solo against the machine, where you're not trying to beat other players' hands. Rather, you'll place a bet from 1 to 5 coins and your return is based on what hand you get. 2 pairs or 3 of a kind give you a small win, flush, straight, full house and so on give progressively more. Anything less than 2 pairs gets you nothing, although if you manage to get a jacks or better pair, you'll get one step closer to one of the game's special bonus rounds, where you're able to multiply your winnings. If you see that J-B box on the right of the screen, the number will tick down each time you do. It starts off at 30 or something like that, so you're gonna have to play for longer than I'm prepared to in order to get it. If you win a hand, you can go play our old pal, the higher or lower game. Sorry, big or small game. Press A if you think the next card's gonna be higher than 7, press B if you think lower. You can earn up to a 50 times multiplier of your winnings should you be able to do this 5 times in a row. Do you remember that cheating nonsense I mentioned in the Neo Cherry Master review, whereby I save stated this minigame and found that actually the computer will just pick the one that you didn't, and therefore make certain rounds of the game unwinnable? Well, of course, I've tested it again with this one, and I must say it hasn't actually happened to me this time, so kudos there, I suppose. Look, I know people do enjoy these sorts of casino games. They must do, or there wouldn't have been so many of them around this era. There's just so little value putting all of these on individual cartridges. Had Dyna Corporation merged all 7 onto a single cartridge and allowed some sort of cumulative money total between all the games, it'd actually be a fairly decent little experience. As is, this doesn't half feel like a waste of money to have to purchase all of them. And this is real money you're spending. You can't just press A to get more once you run out. It's actually, strangely, quite hard to do that though, as you can never bet more than 5 tokens, or at least I haven't found a way to, which strikes me as a little weird. Once you've got 1,000 in your coffers, you can just play forever essentially. That's realistically gonna have to do for this episode. I mean, what else is there to say about this one? One thing I really wanted to verify for myself was just how justified the Neo Geo Pocket's reputation was. This idea that the library is a real quality over quantity thing, not having a ton of games, but what's there is mostly, if not all, good to great. A study of the first 20% or so of the library, as we've already done, crazy to think when I'm so used to these somewhat bloated Game Boy libraries, kinda does give some credence to that notion, I think. Sure, the football game from a while back wasn't outstanding, but really the only other disappointing parts of the system so far has been these Neo Casino games from Dyna Corporation, of which this is the third. Neo Mystery Bonus is not only the third gambling game released by Dyna on the same day, but also the second slot machine one. That makes the whole thing about putting them all on separate cartridges rather than just one even weirder. It's not exactly the same as Neo Cherry Master, there are some subtle differences, but this is still a slot machine gambling thing where you've got to try to line up horizontal or diagonal lines of matching images by stopping these reels in the correct place. There's no upward objective rather than accumulation of as much coinage as possible, but you just add 100 credits each time you run out anyway. If the player has infinite money anyway, why are they even gambling? You already completed it, mate. This one is different in that there are no vertical lines this time. Rather than having 9 individually spinning reels, you have 3 larger ones stacked side by side that have their order of images fixed. You can actually stop them manually this time, whereas in Cherry you couldn't, so if you're an Android, or have access to save states like I do, you can actually use some degree of skill to stop the reels where you want them. Now, I will forewarn you, this video is about to get really frickin' annoying, especially with the sound, but A, there's no way I'm going to organically play this game to grab the footage for you, and B, I really want to demonstrate just how bullshitty this game is with its programming. I know that actual slot machines also do this stuff, and so in that sense it's accurate, but even so, I'm almost convinced that this game will simply decide whether a play is winnable or not. I've shown you the main game here, whereby I've lined up 2 gold coins along the bottom. I can see the third one slinking past just fine, but no matter how many times I save, load to try again, I cannot get that third one to land. It does sometimes, else the game will be unwinnable, but other times the CPU is just like, nope, try again. You can get it 1 notch past or 1 notch before just fine, but in those cases it simply will not land, regardless of which frame you press A on. That's only half of it though. The crux of this one is to make trios of either coins or question marks. If you line up 3 coins, you'll get an extra token for a minigame, collect 5, and you get to play this lucky dip game that reminds me somewhat of Sorayuke Amida-kun, that early JP exclusive Game Boy game by Pachinko Crazy's Coconuts. You'll need to choose one of 3 options at the top, then a hand will descend down these pathways until they arrive at one of 3 sacks. These sacks have random amounts of gold in. You guessed it though, this changes depending on your selection. Pick the leftmost one, you'll get, say, 100, which of course will be lower than the other 2, which in this example ends up having 300 and 400 in. So okay, you reload because you're a sad act with nothing better to do than save state 25-year-old handheld games in order to investigate them and call them out on their nonsense. Pick the middle one this time. Oh yeah, funnily enough, now the middle bag has the 100, the left one now miraculously has 300 in it. You get my point yet? Can I move on? The thing is, the prize you win for getting these bonuses is so small anyway that it's kind of a moot point. You can get more from a single spin of the reels. It wouldn't be one of these without the ridiculous higher or lower than 7 card game things, and we're back to the yeah you can't win this fixery of Neo Cherry Master. Just don't bother, it's totally rigged. Just take your coins and move on. The final minigame happens if you somehow, God only knows how you do this organically, match up 3 question marks. Here, all that happens is you stop 3 numbers, they're added up, then doubled, and you win that. Very anticlimactic indeed. And that's that. Last one for a little bit, thankfully. Do these games tarnish that Neo Geo quality over quantity reputation I spoke of earlier? No, I don't think they do. These are total outliers. Well, there are quite a lot of patchy Slaughterooza Kingdom games to come as well. No, honestly, the thing is, you just have to ignore these, I suppose. They're probably not expensive if you must be a completionist, but you don't need them, and there is enough quality throughout the rest of the library to ensure a pretty healthy ratio. And if the Neo Geo Pocket didn't have that reputation in the first place, we wouldn't even be asking the question. Every other library on the planet has crap like this in it. You only really notice it when that library has 70 games in it rather than 700. Known in North America as Buster Move, the Puzzle Bobble spin-off series of Bobble games have been fairly popular since the first version appeared in arcades in 1994. You control the Dino Brothers, just one in this Neo Geo version, as they crank a rotating pointer back and forth, with the aim being to fire different coloured bubbles upwards into this playfield. Match 3 or more of any colour, touching in any manner you like on the hexagonal grid to eliminate them. You need to try to clear out everything on the screen, after which you'll go to the next stage. The bubbles will hang on the playfield as long as there's a route to the top of the screen, so if you're able to eliminate a group of bubbles, anything clinging solely to them will also fall off the board. The next bubble you can fire is randomly selected, but will only ever be from the colours still present on screen. If you've cleared all the blue ones, for example, you're not going to get any further blues. Also, you might spy a sparkly bubble, which will eliminate everything of whatever colour hits it. Use these strategically, don't just take them out immediately. Look at what your next bubble's going to be, as well as higher up the board, as there may be a specific colour that will take out much more should you be able to clear them, and these are worth waiting for to use the sparkly ones. The ceiling will start to drop periodically as well. The fewer colours that remain, the faster this will come down. If any bubble crosses the bottom line, it's game over. Firing the shots requires some precise aiming, knowing just how far either way you need to move the pointer to get the bubble through a particular gap or not undershoot. If you're even a little bit out, the shot might stick to a part of the board you didn't intend. Not only will you not make the elimination this way, but could also even block off any future shots. A misplaced shot can be punished quite profusely. You'll get the knack of it by process of repetition, of course, and will be firing off multiple successful volleys before too long. There are a couple of flares you can incorporate into your arsenal. Your aims can be fine-tuned by holding B to move the pointer in much smaller increments, and you're also able to fire bubbles off the sides of the playfield to bounce them around obstacles and hit stuff higher up. It's tricky to get, but nail these shots and you feel like a bit of a genius. You've got a few different playstyles. There are 100 predetermined levels that need clearing out in the solo mode with a high scoreboard for the fastest 3 times. Or you can go head to head with 8 different CPU opponents. They're all antagonists from Bobble games as it happens. Here you're both playing your own boards at the same time, and you can throw extra bubbles onto your enemy's screen, although honestly they'll typically just beat themselves. Win a 2 out of 3 contest against any of them to move on to the next. It's a bit of a shame that the AI level doesn't seem to improve at all as you move along. The 8th opponent is equally as incompetent as the first. The third option for gameplay is your good old endurance mode, where you've just got to carry on playing for as long as you can. The game is pretty addictive, like any good block-based puzzler should be, although the difficulty here is kind of on the low side once you've got the hang of the aiming. Probably the continuous mode is what you'll gravitate towards the most, as that's the best test of your skills and stamina. The other 2 modes are a little too easy and truncated, with some levels being over in a matter of seconds. Still, a vibrant and enjoyable entry in the series that does everything you'd need it to, perfect for portable play, and a valuable part of the library for sure. RPGs are few and far between on the Neo Geo, but the small handful that exist are, from what I understand, some of the absolute highlights of the library. While arguably none are pure RPG, with titles like Fazale and Ogre Battle featuring quite a lot of strategy elements as well, one of the more vaunted names on any top 10 list is Biomotor Unitron, the game that possibly comes closest to taking that RPG moniker to its most traditional point. But even then, this actually has quite a lot of dungeon crawling emphasis to it, with the appeal being these procedurally generated, or at the very least randomly chosen, dungeons that demand a fair bit of grinding and gradual progression. Your goal here is to improve your mech by crafting or buying new parts so that you can get further and further into these dungeons and eventually conquer the arena. You play as a Unitron Master, which is both the mechanic and the pilot of the Biomotor Unitron, these massively customizable battle mechs. Starting off with the most basic parts means you'll need to clear out 1, possibly 2 floors of these dungeons, earning money and experience by killing stuff, finding gold and materials in chests, then coming back to the workshop to heal up, buy new parts, or do some crafting. Each part that you add to your mech has lots of different stats assigned to it, and the cumulative totals of those stats equals what your mech actually is. For example, each part, from the CPU core to the legs to the arms, has their own stat for HP. This could be quite high, like 30, or low, like 5 HP, or even have a 0 next to it. So you could craft a new weapon that increases your damage output, but if it has a lower HP value allocated to it than what you already have installed, it'll lower your overall HP, so it's a balancing act. You're going to be looking at these numbers quite a lot while playing, so it's worth going into what they all mean. HP is fairly obvious. When your hit points reach 0, you can no longer battle, and will get whisked off back to the workshop to heal up. This is automatic, which is kinda neat. All you'd need to do is leave the dungeon and you'll be back to full health. EP is your energy points, which shows how much energy is available for using your Unitron's equipped weapons. Everything you equip takes a specific amount of EP to activate, with stronger weapons typically requiring more EP, so this is a critical resource to manage. It'll only become an issue in tougher fights that you can't end in a turn or two, and you'll be glad to know that it replenishes after each battle, so you won't have to trek home or pound items to fix this. When your EP is depleted though, you can only use basic attacks, which are pretty weak, so keep an eye on it and use the charge feature in battle if you need to. AP is your attack power and is primarily influenced by the arms you equip, from the different punches to cannons. There are honestly loads of different parts in this group, and they all have elemental perks, known as affinities, which we'll come on to in a bit. SP is your speed, which dictates whether or not you'll attack first or are able to flee from battle. There doesn't seem to be any luck here, it literally just is whichever of you or your opponent is faster. You might even be able to dodge enemy attacks at higher levels as well. Your DP is defense, which obviously reduces the damage taken from enemy attacks, a crucial stat to look at when you're cruising around anything after Area 3, where the monsters pack a real punch. It's a real crucial one for your longevity here too, because there are no healing spells or anything in the game, and you can only carry up to 9 of each type of healing potion, the fix-it tools. So if you want to be able to progress really far, make sure you can tank some hits. A slightly more nebulous stat is your weight. A higher weight might reduce your speed, but it does make you tankier. It's a tough one to know how to balance. I'd probably say that if your speed stat is high, but you still seem to be attacking second and struggle to run from fights, try to lower your weight. It's often more beneficial to attack first than be more defensively strong, as once you're leveled enough, you can end most fights pretty quickly. It's linked to what materials your parts are made from. Steel is heavy but durable, whereas silver is lighter but a bit weaker. Should you be able to craft mithril parts though, you'll get the best of both worlds. These are incredibly expensive, however. When you start the game, you'll pick between pairs of characters, a male and female human, elf, mariner, birdian, or lizard. There's little difference, save an aesthetic one, but the leg part of your Unitron will be different depending on what you choose. At least that's the only difference I noticed, and you can just buy the other ones if you prefer their stats anyway. Whichever of the girl or boy you pick will be your main character, and the other one will work in the warehouse for you. When you level up in the dungeons, it's your protagonist that levels up, and this increases your control, which has various minor effects on your mecha. You can level up your partner too, but it's done differently. In the workshop, you can craft new parts from old ones if you have the correct material. For instance, one simple trip into a dungeon will more than likely allow you to find some steel at the very least. You can combine this with your basic arms to create stronger ones that have higher stats or do slightly different things. This is primarily how you'll fill those pages of the parts manual, which at the start of the game has hundreds of blank entries, and encompasses this game's collect-em-up gimmick, where you can try to complete the manual if you want. Note that forging isn't 100% guaranteed. It depends on the complexity of the parts and the materials, and also the level of your accomplice. The more you craft, the higher their level will go, so it's worth buying some junker parts that you're not going to use to fix up then sell on. You can increase this chance by using tools that you can buy or find in the wild. This will boost the success rate from, say, 84% to 89% or something like that. Note that not all arms can be improved, and not all materials are compatible with all parts. Steel is great for boosting your arms, but gold is going to be useless in this regard, nor is it much good for armor. You'll need to save that for the innards like new cores and such. Make sure as well to buy 2 accessories. They're in the items menu in the shop rather than the parts one for some reason, as these will give you nice little stat boosts, reduce EP cost or increase regen, or even improve your critical hit rate. As previously mentioned, each weapon has its own elemental affinity, and this is very important to take note of. You'll see each one has a little symbol attributed to it that don't really look like much, but you can see what they all mean by looking in the help files in the workshop. Each one also has an affinity it's strong against, as well as one it's weak to. Don't worry that you're going to have to switch out weapons all the time when in a dungeon to match enemies' typings, as they don't really work like that. Each dungeon has a specific affinity that their monsters specialize in, and it's up to you to calibrate your mech beforehand to give it weapons that are strong against everything you'll find in there. For example, the forest dungeon that I've explored in this video for the most part has enemies in it that all have a wood affinity. As you might expect, it benefits you to equip fire weapons, as they're a total hard counter for wood and will give you a wicked boost. Make sure to always exploit these weaknesses, you'll struggle otherwise. The dungeons themselves, as I mentioned at the start of this review, are seemingly procedurally generated. Whether this is actually the case or whether there are a selection of builds that the game randomly picks from is hard to say exactly, as with the small handful of level elements on offer, the dungeons do still feel quite repetitive after a while. All you really need to know is that if you leave and come back, the dungeon will have reset and will now be different. This is important though, as in each area there are leveled chests containing either money or items, or sometimes nothing. By leveled, I mean that the gold you'll find in Area 1 is considerably less than what you'll find in Area 4, for example. These chests also reset, emphasizing this idea of repeating dungeons many times to grind for money. You can quite easily just do Area 1, then leave, rinse and repeat, if all you're trying to do is earn money. You'll know when it's time to push further on though, when you start only getting 1 XP per fight. That's a surefire sign that you're too strong for this bit. Move animations and character sprites are basic but effective, as are the dungeon's designs, which, while lacking in variation, still look good. The music is catchy, with upbeat tracks that match the game's adventurous tone. However, the limited sound capabilities of the console means the sound effects don't really add much and can become repetitive after a while. There are plenty of different dungeons and a fairly interesting story that plays out behind the scenes. For the first half or more of the game, you won't see a lot of it, as you're just trying to get as strong as you can to fight the arena mode, but persist for long enough and the narrative will start to unfold. It's a bit of a shame that there's not more to do with the NPCs you can meet in the town hub area, but what you do get adds a bit of personality to the world to save it from becoming a complete grindfest. If grindy, repetitive RPGs and mech trainers aren't your thing, I don't think you'll play this for a prolonged period of time. But if that is your thing, then there are few better 8-bit RPGs to fill that role for you. I'm all about it. The footage I've shown in this video constitutes around my first 3 or 4 hours of gameplay, but it's fair to say I carried on for way longer after the fact. Definitely looking forward to the Japanese exclusive sequel, Kiko Seiki Unitron. More color, more power. The exciting chase of a lifetime is on. Finish painting roads before the monsters stop you. Grab those amusing, pesky irksters. So okay, the tagline gives away as little of the game's gimmick as does the rather ambiguous title, but what we essentially have here is a single-screen arcade-style ground coverer, as I like to call them. The sort of thing very much like Pac-Man and games of that ilk that demand you cover every inch of a maze of some kind while trying to flee monsters. The screens wrap around in such a way that you can leave a passage at the top of the screen and reappear at the bottom. Or, similarly, left to right. Here you're not trying to collect pellets, but the principle is the same. Your task is to paint by walking over every tile on these road maps and not get caught by the enemies. So by that token, it's probably more akin to Painter Momopai, a Japanese exclusive Game Boy game, although without the weapons you could use in that one. The first game to use the name Crush Roller came about as far back as 1981 in Japan and Europe. For those of you stateside who are connoisseurs of that early 80s arcade style of game, you might recognize this as being called Make Tracks. It's the same game essentially. There aren't power pellets or the equivalent here, so no way to actually attack the enemies, save one. You might see a paint roller on a longer straight of road. If you touch that from behind, it'll carry you quickly to the end of the straight. Should you run over a monster, it'll kill it and send it temporarily back to its spawn point for a little while. The monsters don't seem to actually intelligently chase you directly, as they'll often take a different turn to you, even if seemingly following behind. It must be a random choice every time they come to an intersection, which path they'll move down, so at least there's no devious AI between the two of them, whereby they corner you and cut off all your escape routes. This'll still happen sometimes though, don't get me wrong. Don't think that this makes them easier to avoid, though, because while one of them moves at the same speed as you, the other one is actually faster. Getting caught on a long piece of road without a choice of turns is dangerous, as with the quicker one on your tail, you don't have an escape option. As well as the two malignant enemies, there's a different critter hiding somewhere in the grid. Should you paint part of the road adjacent to where it's hiding, it'll pop out with a hello and meander around the roads for a bit. It'll stamp footprints into any paint you've laid, meaning you'll need to recover that ground. But if you can catch it before it disappears, you'll earn an extra life once the level is complete. You might get to a point on a stage where it seems you've painted everywhere, but the level isn't ending. What's probably happened here is that you've turned a corner somewhere and left a tiny little pixel or two uncovered in doing so. It can be hard to search for it while you're being hunted, so it's worth being thorough as you go. When you do manage to cover the whole road area, you'll move on and actually get a choice of levels. For example, you can press left, up, or right in between levels to pick where you want to go, although you don't get a preview of the upcoming stage, so I don't know what the point in it is, necessarily. You'll go through 5 banks, if you like, of levels, whereby the first is always the same. You get a choice of 3 for stage 2, which in turn branch off to 6 potential stage 3s, 7 4s and 8 5s. However, it all culminates in the same final level, 6-1. I suppose you'll learn which your favourites are. You get 3 lives to start with, but Infinite Continues will let you get through the whole thing, if you're not bothered about once CCing it. Controls are really responsive, which is a massive plus point in games like this. If you need to desperately dart down a different path, you can do. You're really only limited by your own reflexes. Thankfully, there are only ever 2 enemies on screen, but with the speed everything moves, this is more than enough to handle. Graphically, this isn't the peak of what the Neo Geo Pocket Color was capable of, but neither is it super primitive or anything. The cityscapes look kinda nice, although possibly some of the color choices could have been more interesting. The intro and in-between levels look very good actually. Audibly, it's very middle of the road for this console, which is to say, it's not really an area where the Neo Geo shines all that much anyway. Not irritating, you honestly won't really notice the music. The limited collection of sound effects you get are pretty good. If you get through the main game, you can go through a time trial, which gives you a time limit to beat the levels as well, to ramp up the challenge. As a simple arcade conversion, this is a thoroughly competent little game that's sure to keep you entertained for a short while.